Hello everyone, welcome to AWS Tutorials. In AWS Tutorials, we provide workshops and exercises to learn about AWS services. These workshops and exercises are published to our website aws-dozo.com, and you can implement scenarios using these workshops and exercises to learn about AWS services. Today, we are going to talk about one of the AWS AI services, Fraud Detector. This is part of this AI services programming series. We have started for quite some time. This is the fifth part of that series, and today's service is Fraud Detector. So let's get some understanding about AWS AI services. A really quick one. So AWS provides certain AI services as APIs, which any developer can call to build AI-enabled applications. So for instance, we have services like recognition, which can be used for both audio and video and image analysis. We have service like Poly and Transcribe, which can convert text into speech and can also reverse speech into text. There's services like Translate, which can translate one language into another. Similar to these services, Fraud Detector is also one of the service which we are going to talk about in detail today. These services, for these services, you don't need to train your models, you don't need to deploy your models, test your models, none of those data science specific things you have to do, machine learning things specific you have to do. You have to simply call these services as an API and build applications using them. So all you need is a developer knowledge. You don't need to be a data scientist for this. So having get an introduction about AWS AI services, let's talk about today's service, which is Fraud Detector. As the name suggests, this service is used to build models which can detect frauds. Okay, so this service has primarily got three parts. Well, two parts, and one part is consumer. So yeah, it has got two parts. One part is your Amazon Fraud Detector, where you actually you can what you do for to enable this service is that you need to have in this particular service, especially not with many other AI services where you have to simply call the API, but in this service, actually need to train your data. But it is further simplified using a framework in place. So what you need to do that you need to have certain set of data which has at least 10,000 records and certain fields, and I will talk about that later in the video. But you need to have certain data for the training purposes, and that training data should have information, records or events which are categorized as these are the say fraud records or events, these are the legitimate events or records, and such a mix of training data can then be used with Amazon Fraud Detector to create a model, and then that model is then deployed, and then you can use API based call to that model to determine if one individual event or record is fraud or not. So that's how it works. So if you try to build such a model without using Fraud Detector, you have to do a lot of works. But in this case, the whole thing is simplified because you're using the framework of the Fraud Detector. So the way it works, guys, is that you upload your historical data, your training data into your S3 bucket, and then you configure your fraud detector. And in order to configure the fraud detector, you have to really yeah, select, okay, this is the data I'm going to use for fraud detector, identify the features of the data, for instance, what are the variable features you want to use into your data, and then you select the algorithm you want to use to detect the fraud, and then you start the training of your model. Once your model has been trained, you can validate the performance of the model to see how accurate your model is. And then once you are happy with the performance of the model, you can host your model, you can deploy your model. So that is one part where you take a historical data, training data, go through all these steps to for deploy your model. Once your model has been deployed, in order to use this model as an API to really determine whether a particular event or record or transaction is fraud or not, you create something called defect detector logic. And when you create a defect detector logic, actually you set certain parameters, certain business logic, which works with the model to determine whether a particular record you are passing as a parameter, whether that record or that event is a legitimate event or it is a fraud event. And then it also provides services which are APIs which are then used by your client applications to make call, pass, event or record as a parameter and get back a response whether this event or record is a fraud or legitimate event or record. So that's why I said that there are three parts to this solution. One part is where you go and deploy your model. The second part is where you configure your detection logic. And the third one is you use API with your client applications to really call the detection logic and check whether a particular event or record is legitimate or not. So it looks very complex, guys, but it is not that complex. I will take you through the steps, what you need to do to make it work. This is a little lengthy work for sure, a little time consuming, but trust me, it's very simple to use. So what we are going to build today is pretty straightforward thing. We have a sample training data, which we got from AWS, in fact, in one of their exercises. And then we are simply using that data to configure the model, to deploy the model and configure the detector, detector logic. And then after that, we are going to use Jupyter Notebook to create a Python client, which will make call to this detector logic to check whether the record it is passing as a parameter is a legitimate record or it is a fraud record. So that's what we are going to build today. So this whole flow we are going to implement end to end. In order to run this scenario or exercise, we have a workshop, a hands-on lab created, and this lab is published to our website, aws-dojo.com. This is the URL of that lab, and we have also provided this URL in the description box below, and you can use that. So what I'm going to do next is that I'm going to walk you through the steps involved in this lab, in this workshop, to explain what is happening there. And post that, actually you can use this URL to run this lab or workshop by yourself and implement this whole scenario end to end. So let me go to the workshop. So here is our website, aws-dojo.com, where I have published the workshop. And here you can click on this link over here, start the workshop, to start the workshop. And then this workshop has got multiple steps involved, total 7 steps actually. Let's go through these steps one by one. So all you have to do is simply follow the steps one by one, and you will be able to implement your scenario. So let's go the first one. So first step is pretty straightforward, and that is you need to have an AWS account in order to complete this workshop. And if you don't have any AWS account, use this link over here to create a new account. Then the next step is talking a bit about the data. So the data we are using for training purpose. Here's a link to download the data. This data we are simply reusing one of the data which is provided by AWS itself for the learning purposes. And this data has got actually four fields: IP address, email address, event time span, and event label. And let me explain it here. So basically what you're trying to say here is that someone is trying to say, in this example, for instance, someone is trying to say log into or create login to your website. And then they are using this email ID and this IP address. And what it's saying is that timestamp says that this is the time when that particular login or account creation activity is happening. And then this event label says that which of this one is a legitimate account or login, and which of this was not what a fraud account. By the way, the sample you see here is got all legitimate, but it has got a mix of legitimate and fraud both. So it's pretty straightforward. All we want to check is that if someone is trying to say login or trying to say create an account with your website, this is the IP address, this is the email address. Is it a legitimate account or event for the account creation, or it is a fraud? So one very important thing for you to know that in order to choose a data set like this, your data should have minimum 10,000 records. That's mandatory, and should mandatorily have these two fields. So event timestamp and event label. These two are mandatory fields in your data set for the training. Event timestamp represents the date time when this event happened. Yeah, as simple as that. And event label actually represents whether this particular event or record was a legitimate one or a fraud one. So for instance, if the last column has got a value called legit, that means it is a legitimate record. And then if it has got a value fraud, then it's a fraud record. And then this is the data we have got, and we are going to use this data here to train our model inside fraud detector. So what we did then after that, we created an S3 bucket called Dojo fraud records. And then once we created this bucket, we simply uploaded this sample data to this bucket. So my data is ready. My training data is ready inside my S3 bucket. The next step is to create a fraud detector. It's quite a lengthy step, but pretty straightforward. So in order to create a fraud detector model, actually you first create model and then you create detector logic. So in order to create a fraud detector model, you start with creation of one event. You give this event a nice name, and we are saying this is my dojo event. Then you give this, then you choose an entity. Entity is kind of way of deciding your data. Okay, defining your data. So you're saying okay, I'm going to create a new entity for this event, and then you give this new entity the name called dojo entity. So you created an event first, dojo event, and then you created a new entity called dojo entity. So once you have created the event and the entity, then it's okay, what are the different variables I'm going to create? So say, okay, I have created my event. Now I want to select the variables. So for instance, the variables are the things which the model uses to determine using machine learning that this is a fraud event or this is a legitimate event. So for instance, in our data, we have got 4 columns, right? So one column is timestamp. One is the event label itself, whether it's a legitimate or fraud. And 2 other columns are IP addresses and email addresses. This IP addresses and email address combination actually will be used in machine learning to determine whether, as per the machine learning model, whether this particular record is a fraud record, a legitimate record. So it is asking us here that how do you select the variable? How do you define the variable? And we are saying here that we are going to select the variable from the training data set. Okay, as simple as that. Then we create a role for the fraud detector. Of course, fraud detector is going to use call many services like S3 bucket and so on, and we need a role which authorizes fraud detector to do that. And then we do that, and then it tells, okay, tell me which S3 bucket. So for instance, this role needs to have access to the certain S3 bucket where the training data has been stored. So it is asking that, okay, tell me which S3 bucket your data is, so that role can be granted access to that one. And then it also asks that, okay, tell me where the data is, where the training data is. So pretty much what you did in this step is that you said, I'm going to use my training data set to determine my variable, to define my variable. Then you created a role which grants permission to the S3 bucket where the data is stored. And then you also provide the location of the training data. Once you provide a location of the training data, fraud detector will analyze that, okay, so this data has got 4 columns, and out of these 4 columns, 2 are anyway talking about time when the event happened, and 1 is the actual result itself. So those we cannot use as a variable. The only one left are IP address and email address. So that we are going to use as the variables. Now, it might happen that in your data you have got more than 1, 2, or 3, or even more variables. Not necessarily every variable is required. If you think that certain variable is there in data, but I don't think it determines the fraud, the occurrence of the fraud. Then you can remove that variable. So, for instance, someone's name, or city where the person was living. I mean, there could be case where you have a data where certain variable, that for instance, if it is it really affects the outcome of the fraud. And if you think that there's such variable, then you can simply remove variable. If you're not confident, keep it there. In our case, we have got only 2 variables, and we believe that these 2 variables do play a role in determining whether a particular record is a fraud or not. So we have simply loaded the data, then it shows me these 2 variables, IP address, email address. We define the variable type, and then we move next. Then it says, okay, tell me that which one is your data. Then we go and define the labels. So label is like an outcome. So for instance, in this case, we are interested to know which event is fraud and which event is legitimate. But you can have more than 2 labels as well. Okay, it has to be minimum 2 labels actually. You can have more than 2 as well. You could have a case like that as well. But in this case, since we are interested only in a legitimate record and a fraud record, we go and define 2 labels called legit. One is legit label, and the second is a fraud label. So we define two labels. So far, we have defined our variables, our label. We have told where my training data is. We defined the events and the entities, and then you simply say, I want to build my model. As simple as that. I want to build my model. And when you try to build the model, it will ask you certain information. Tell me your model name. You provide the model name. Then select the model type. Now, model type determines what kind of supervised machine learning models you're going to use. In this case, we are using this online fraud insights, which is a model which can be used to find risk of fraud with like new account frauds or online payment frauds or fake review frauds. Those kind of frauds it can determine. So we simply select this model because in this case, we're trying to find whether if someone is trying to create account with this IP address and email, whether this is a legitimate event or record or it's a fraud one. So we select this particular model, online fraud inside. You select your event type, and then it also asks you that, okay, tell me where my data is, my historical data is, where is my training data is. You provide location to your training data, and then it will again confirm that, okay, which are variables you're going to use as an input. And we are saying, okay, we are going to use email address and IP address as an input. Then it will tell me, okay, tell me what value, what label I will consider as a fraud label and what label I will consider as a legitimate label. And remember, these two labels we configured earlier. So we are saying here that if you find a value called fraud, that means it is a fraud record. And if you find a value called legit, then it is a legitimate record. So we are configuring all those things, telling the model these inputs. And then we simply go and train the model. The training the model can take a really long time, guys. Like in my case, when I was building this workshop, it took almost 50 minutes to finish the model. So once the model has been finished, you can see the model has been created. Here's the version 1.0. You might want to go inside and see the model performance, but it provides a lot of good information. So if you go inside the model and try to check the details, here is what we find. It tries to find a score for. So if you provide this, okay, this is my IP address and my email address. Tell me it is a fraud, or this combination is fraud or legitimate. It will try to find a score for that combination. And right now, the score distribution for this model is that if the score comes around 500, then there is a 92.9% chance that this email address and IP address combination is fraud event, and there is a 13.6% chance that this is a legitimate event. And this is very important, guys, because later when we go and create the business logic, we are actually going to use the score to create the business logic. So we are going to say, okay, fine, if I find a score like this, what should I do with this record? Should I consider this record as a fraud record, or should I consider this record as a legitimate record? So we will revisit this score thing again, but try to understand in a way that when you're trying to find whether a particular IP address and email address combination is fraud or not, you provide that as an input, the model will give you back a score, and with that score, you can determine what is the probability of this being a fraud event versus a legitimate event. And here right now, the way the performance is that if the score is 500, it is 92.9% fraud event and 13.6% legitimate event. Having done that, we simply go and we deploy the model. So once the model has been deployed, now it is time to go and consume the model using the fraud detector business logic. So we go to the fraud detector business logic creation. We provide it a nice name called, say, Dojo Detector. It tells, okay, which event you are interested in. We select the Dojo event which you choose earlier, and then it says, okay, tell me which model you want to use for this detector business logic. And in the earlier step, we have created this Dojo fraud detector detection model. We are simply selecting that model over here. And then it says, okay, now create the rules of business logic. So what we are going to do in this case is that we are going to create business rule in such a way that if you provide an IP address and email address, I can tell you whether what is the risk of fraud with this. And risk of the fraud will try to determine high risk, medium risk, and low risk. So here I'm creating a rule for the high risk, and I'm saying that if my high risk rule is that if my Dojo fraud detection model score is greater than 800, then most probably this IP address to email address combination is high risk for the fraud. Okay, so that's the rule number one we created. And then we create two, and we say if the score comes as 800, by the way, then then tell the outcome, or return back that it is a high risk combination. Okay, simple. And then so it very much looks like this. It says that if my score is more than 800, then it is a high risk thing. Okay, and you add this role. Then you add two more roles, because I'm trying to determine whether my risk is high, medium, or low. So my rule for the medium is that if the score is between 800 to 500, then it is a medium risk. And if it is less than 500, then it is a low risk for the fraud. Okay, so we simply create this rule, and then after that, we simply add these three rules. So you can create as many rules you want. I mean, in this case, or you can create very binary rules saying that this is a fraud, this is not a fraud. Here I try to create three rules just to convey whether it's a high risk, medium risk, or low risk. So up to you how you want to use a score to determine the outcome of your risk assessment. And then we are selecting, okay, I want to do for the first match for the record, and then simply go and create the detector, and you create a detector and you publish it. Okay, once you have published the detector, actually you can do testing, local testing. I mean, on the fraud detector screen, page itself, you can do the testing of your detector business logic. And for that, you have to click on run test. And when you go for run test, you have to literally provide some input. So you're saying that, okay, I'm going to run the test. This is my timestamp, and then this is my some sample entity ID. This is my email address and IP address combination. Run the test. Tell me my risk, and my outcome comes 392 when I run this. So you can see that my outcome comes 392, and because it's 392, it is less than 500. That means the low risk. Okay, good. So we run the test and realize, okay, fine, my detector business logic seems to be working fine. So you might want to run multiple tests just to check and validate more, but here I showed you how you run the test. Now my fraud detector is ready. I'm all good to go and make an API call to this fraud detector. So in order to do so, first we'll set up the development environment, and this development environment we are setting up inside SageMaker notebook actually. So in SageMaker notebook, we first go and create a role which my SageMaker notebook will use, and so I'm simply launching creating a SageMaker notebook, giving it some privilege which gives it access to call other services, and then we simply go to the SageMaker and launch a notebook. When I launch a notebook, I provide it a nice notebook name, and then I select the role which gives it permission to call other services, and then I simply launch the notebook. And I wait till my notebook instance status changes to in service. Once my notebook status changes to in service, now I'm all good to make call to the detector business logic. So I go to create the client. So you go and open the Jupyter notebook. Then you need to set up one file in the notebook with the proper runtime. And in this case, we are selecting a Conda Python 3. Well, I'm not so much interested in Conda, but I'm interested in Python Run 3 environment. That's why I selected this particular runtime environment, and then it creates a file for me to run inside the notebook. It creates a notebook file for me, and then I write down my business logic here. So this is the business logic you write. It's pretty straightforward, guys. You have to provide your, of course, input like what is your entity, what is your event, what is your detector, which version of the detector we are going to use, and then you simply create client for the fraud detector, and then you call this get event prediction method. And in this you pass all these parameters. What is important here is that you are passing email address and IP address combination as a parameter, and you are interested to know whether this combination is a low risk or high risk. So you provided that combination, and then in fact, yeah, you call this method by passing these parameters. You get a response back, and you're printing the response. So what we are going to do next is that we run this code. When you run this code, actually, you can see here in the response, I haven't tried to not to parse it to present the whole thing, but you can very much figure out that the score came out around 979, which makes it a high risk outcome. So this email combination is a high risk combination as per the training data based model we have created in our fraud detector. So that pretty much finishes the workshop, guys, where you used sample training data to create a model inside fraud detector to detect the fraud, and then you made an API based call to that model using a detector business logic to determine whether the certain events or record is a fraud or a legitimate record. So that was all for today. The next step is to go and clean up the resources so that you don't incur any cost post the workshop. If you like this video, guys, please click on the like button. Please subscribe to our channel. There are many other such videos, such workshops and exercises in our website aws-dojo.com, which you can use to learn about AWS services. I strongly recommend you use these exercises and workshop to learn about AWS services. If you have any feedback, comments, or request for new content, you can either provide us in the YouTube channel, or you can also click on the contact us button and provide feedback over there. Okay. If you have, yeah. That was all for today. Hope you like this video, and please click on the like button if you like this video. And yeah, I look forward to your comments and feedback. That is all for today. Have a nice day. Bye bye.